Now, China's decision to drop all tariffs for 53 African countries is a massive shift that turns the continent into a VIP trading partner. By removing these taxes, China is making it much cheaper for African farmers and businesses, especially in powerhouses like South Africa and Egypt, to get their goods onto Chinese shelves. Now, on paper, this is a huge win that could spark job growth and bring in new investment for companies looking for cheaper ways to access the world's second largest economy. However, the free price tag doesn't mean that there aren't strings attached. Now, the real challenge is that most African exports are still just raw materials like minerals and oils. While building their own factories to process these goods, African nations risk staying stuck as resource suppliers while China sells them back the finished goods or the finished products. Plus, even without taxes, African businesses still jump over very high bars regarding Chinese food safety and quality standards. So it's a wide open door, but only the countries with the best infrastructure and highest quality control will be able to walk through it. Joining us on this conversation, we have Rugare Mukanganga, economist in Harare, Zimbabwe. We also have Charles Onunaiyu, director of the Center for China Studies in Nigeria, in Abuja. We also have Kelvin Chisanga, economist in Lusaka, Zambia, and Herbert Kafeero, who is Deputy Executive Director, Seatini in Entebbe, Uganda. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. It's a full house. All right, so let's get straight to the heart of this. And let's begin with the first person on my list, Rugare. Rugare, I'm actually sure that all of you are experts, on and have followed the FOCAC, that's the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation cycles for decades. Now, to start with, Rugare, Beijing is framing this 100% tariff-free access as a historic breakthrough. Yet, we know that 33 African nations already had some of this or some form of this. So can you walk us through the actual new value here for middle-income giants like South Africa, Kenya, Egypt, who have been clamoring for this for years?
See this new tariff removal as a win for the continent in the sense that Africa's trade relationship with China is increasingly aligned with Africa's long-term development vision. So if the African Continental Free Trade Area is the foundation of the continent's future trade, whether this is internally among our countries or with international partners like China, then this preferential trade agreement or removal of tariffs further aligns with the continental vision of working together as one body, whether it's looking at trade or in other contexts. So there's increased alignment between the continent's development future and vision and how it's engaging with international partners. I also see it as a win for Africa in the sense that this is a tangible example of success in the context of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, as well as the World Trade Organization. So from the FOCAC lens, removal of trade barriers has been a key negotiation point from African countries when they're engaging with China. So this is a tangible example of the success of political engagements. But then going back to WTO, when China became a member in the early 2000s, it agreed to this commitment to gradually liberalize trade and remove trade barriers. And it's taken some time, but here we are. We've got this removal of tariff across the continent. So it's a success from that perspective as well. And also, if you think of this increasingly volatile global trade environment, this removal of tariffs is important. It supports industries that are looking for viable markets, secure markets in a medium to long-term perspective. So, yeah, I think of these three things as wins for Africa in that sense.
All right. Now, Charles, I'm sure you heard what Rugare has said, but then despite the rhetoric of a win-win cooperation, the trade deficit between Africa and China, hit a staggering $64 billion in 2023. So how does removing tariffs on the African side fix a deficit that is driven almost entirely by Africa's massive hunger for Chinese manufactured goods?
Let's be very clear. The zero tariff treatment for 100% of African products to China is not just coming from nowhere. Like you may know, China and Africa have been partners for quite some time. In 2005, of course, China made a tariff-free entry for products from the least developed countries in Africa, which at that point we are 33 countries in Africa to export tariff-free to China. And now they have, of course, you have spoken about the trade imbalance. You know, the latest trade figure is over $300 billion between the two sides, with China having about 60% or more favorable trade. And my view is the current process of enabling African products to gain entry to China with no tariff would be able to redress some of this. But definitely a lot of work to do. And let me say, the latest is not just an isolated case. China has established a trade facilitation hub in Changsha, the capital of Hunan province in China, since 2018, following the summit of China-African countries in 2018. The Trade Facilitation Hub hosts China-Africa Trade and Economic Expo. This is one central region that hosts African Trade Outlook that purports to grant China-African countries trade access to China. So it's been evolving. It just didn't happen from the outer space, from the blues. What we're seeing, what will take place from May 1st, will be a broader application of a pattern that has been evolving over time of incrementally providing trade access. And this is very significant at a point, of course, where you know that there are more or less growing trade restrictions across the world, especially with our traditional partners. AGOA has only been renewed for 1 year, and 1 year renewal of AGOA cannot be enough for businesses to strategize, develop products, read markets, and so it's almost a non-starter, which means AGOA is almost effectively out of the way for Africa. And this is coming at such a difficult moment. It provides both opportunities and challenges, which I hope we'll be discussing in the course of our dialogue.
Yeah, but, absolutely.
So
now coming back to Kelvin. Kelvin, historically, you know, over 70% of what Africa sends to China is raw minerals and fuels. And I know that Charles already said that, you know, the relationship has actually been evolving for a while. But without a specific mechanism to encourage value addition on the continent, why shouldn't we view this policy as simply a more efficient way for China to extract African resource while keeping the high-paying manufacturing jobs in Guangdong?
Okay, so this is where it is actually even calling us a moral obligation for most of the Africans to come together, create the synergetic fusion so that we can basically work as one unity in unison. And again, it's also coming at a backdrop of the African continental free trade area, where we're talking of trying to activate industrialization and also value addition. I think it presents an opportunity which is quite important and significant in the sense that we should now create harmonization of voices in terms of doing policy coordination that we can actually be able to see how certain things can work from there. So it's an opportunity that basically we'll be able to present a one single voice, especially at the point when we are also working in fragmented trade groups like SADC, COMESA, ECOWAS, Eastern African Community. I think it's cause for harmonization now to see how best we can work toward creating that one unity, as well as creating that unison voice in the African market. And this also coming at a point when the global trade in terms of policy, tariff, and many other aspects are also changing the situation. So it's an important aspect where we're building up a policy strategically to just make sure that we basically create the value addition proportion to increase also the job creation that need to be underscored from there. So it's an important platform that will bring trade dynamics and the mechanics just right in place.
All right. Now, you've talked about harmonization now, but we often hear that tariffs are down, but the walls are still high. So if a Kenyan, for example, a Kenyan avocado farmer or a Namibian beef producer cannot meet China's incredibly stringent SPS, that's sanitary and phytosanitary standards, does a 0% tariff provide any tangible market access? This is for Herbert.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I would like to emphasize that, of course, beyond the announcement of the progressive expansion of the duty-free offer, there is really a lot that needs to be done, especially in terms of negotiations. And I would like to really straight link it to the question that you asked. For example, each agricultural product, all food product, needs to obtain a specific phytosanitary protocol, which is actually negotiated between China and the exporting country. So that alone speaks to the fact that beyond removal of tariffs, there are other non-tariff barriers, which of course include the phytosanitary standards and measures. And so the removal of tariffs alone does not guarantee market entry, because the announcement that China made only guarantees market access. But for market entry to be achieved, especially getting our products and products from different African countries on the shelves of Chinese shops, and also to boost and stimulate trade between African countries that are benefiting from this duty-free offer, there is need to address the market entry requirements. And in trade is about a specific market and a specific product. So the specific market now is the Chinese market, given the duty-free offer. And the specific products, we have a range of products that we export to China. So take the example of avocado. Kenya has done this before, but of course what Kenya had to do in order to penetrate the Chinese market, the government of Kenya made intentional and deliberate steps to negotiate product-specific agreements. And the product here was the avocado with China, and China sent an advance team to Kenya. And so the advance team, of course, comprised of representatives from bureaus of standards and the relevant government officials that went down up to the level of farmers' cooperatives. So there was mobilization of the farmers, dissemination of the information, and of course the Standards Bureau and the Ministry of Agriculture played a key role together with the Ministry of Trade. That's what needs to happen. We need a strategy. We need a twofold strategy, both internally in our respective countries, but also engaging China, to the end that internally we have organized our house, we have enhanced the capacity of the private sector, and back with China we've negotiated to secure market entry beyond market access that is guaranteed by the announcement.
Okay. Now let's come back to Rugare. Rugare, looking at Chinese customs procedures, we know that they're notoriously complex for foreign SMEs. Beyond the tax break, what evidence is there? Do we have that Beijing is willing to dismantle the bureaucratic red tape that has historically, prevented African finished goods from reaching Chinese shelves?
It's been mentioned a few times in this conversation with my colleagues here, in the sense that Africa and China have had a long-standing relationship. So if we look back at the evolution of Africa's relationship with China and how over time commitments made and engagement outcomes have become increasingly targeted. If you look back to maybe FOCAC 1, FOCAC 2, we had broad-level agreements and discussions, but over time, as African interests, African coordination has improved, we've been more specific about what we want out of these engagements with China. So over time, because of this increasingly targeted set of outcomes that are coming out, I think this is also a recognition of the policy level changes that are needed to truly achieve a win-win outcomes between African countries and China. but I also see it as a recognition of the administrative and bureaucratic barriers that are currently standing in the way of improving Africa-China cooperation. So both of these need time and several rounds of discussions and negotiations between countries before we finally see red tape being removed.
Okay. Now, but coming back to Charles, critics often point to the commodity trap. So how can African governments ensure that this deal does not undermine the AfCFTA by making it more profitable to ship raw materials to Shanghai than to trade processed goods with a neighbor?
Okay, I think before that, I would just like to speak about, you spoke about bureaucratic rule in Beijing. I want to say that the red tape and all that. In the past few years, China has established what they call Greenland. Greenland is preferential concessional treatment of products coming from Africa. But like you said, what is very important about what China has done in terms of Africa is not so much even for China, but for Africa. You know, with what you have just said about standardization, you could build an internal supply chain in which one African country could do processing, one could produce, one could standardize. So you are building a continental supply chain. You know, you are building, you are making use of the economy of scale, you know, of Africa. This is actually what was envisaged. If you go back to the document, one of Africa's most important documents on self-reliance, which I call the Lagos Plan of Actions in 2000, in 1980, you know, it spoke about integration and building industrial integration in which you could process, you could take advantage of where you have strength. So in my view, beyond access to this market, it is also going to create a much more integrated supply chain within Africa, where countries with less industrial strength, with produce of a could produce, and you could process in Africa and add value and then access the Chinese market. You're talking about, let's say, fruit, you know, the size of the fruit, the color of the fruit, all this comes into play. So what is important is that we have a market, you know, because one of the challenges of Africa in the past is having access to market. You know, for many years with Europeans, it never happened. They would prefer we are their market, but we have very little access to their own market. Now we have access to the market, and we think within the context of even the African Free Trade Area, we can build a very viable internal supply chain, which will give us a greater value in terms of production. So this whole question of commoditization may not really arise. And let me tell you, we have a relative industrial and production capacity cooperation with China. And if you realize that a whole range of Chinese companies, on account of their transformation, their transformative economy, which is upgrading to innovation and then centered on consumption, because the whole content of the 15 5-year plan, which will drive China economic process in the next 5 years, is going to focus on consumption and building an integrated single market that is the largest in the world. So for me, it is not so much what individual African countries can do for themselves. It is the integrated supply chain, the value chain that can be built within Africa that is also of importance. So if you're talking about value addition, we can have value addition in Africa, and we don't need to export just raw commodity to Africa. There is prospects for building an integrated value chain that will give us some leverage in accessing Chinese market. Okay. For me, the most important thing is the market exists, and we've been granted access to it. Like my young friend from Uganda stated about entry, we can build a supply chain that makes for more efficient entry to Chinese market. Of course, the idea that the market is there does not mean that anything can be taken to the market. Yeah. Standardization and processing value addition are very key. And of course, countries that are much more ready for this, you know, a whole lot of things needed to be taken into consideration. You know, you build logistics, access to production, increased productivity, supporting sectors, supporting practitioners in the various sectors, incentivizing them through credit allocation. All these are wide range of for Nigeria. Let me emphasize more importantly for Nigeria, we can because for Nigeria with our size, with the availability of what we have, we can. But then we need a very important policy. Just recently, just last week, I saw a group of people in Southeast Nigeria talking about empowerment. You give bread, you give rice, you give this. You know, these are not empowerment in any sense.
All right, Charles.
The real empowerment. Okay.
All right. Now, Charles, let's come to Kelvin. Now, while Charles has actually said that we now have access to Chinese markets, let's talk about the total African debts to Chinese lenders, which is estimated to be over $170 billion. Is there a risk that these trade concessions are being used as a diplomatic softener to avoid the much more difficult conversations needed, around debt cancellation and transparency?
Okay, so doing it with the trade system and mechanism, I think it would be much easier. Maybe I can even just give this an example of a Zambian case. In Zambia, we've got a situation where we have some debts that are dominated to China and, of course, bilateral as well as the commercial debts from that point. So what we have put in place is that we've got some Chinese miners who are basically interplaying into the mining sector. So what used to happen before what we have done so far is that we would take the dollar as the taxi receipt in terms of their interplay. And then later on, we'll take it in dollar form. Then again, we'll be able to take it in Chinese currency to pay the debts in China. So in all essence, what we have put in place is that we've got a certain lever that is working out in terms of paying Chinese debts based on Chinese currency. So this is where we're also seeing the whole situation in terms of currency dynamic and system. We'll be able to actually see that to gravitate to start using Chinese currency as well alongside trade matrix, which is actually coming to the fore. So it's important that we need to look at how best can we interplay from there. Already, the whole scenario here is that we have Chinese projects that are in roads and belt infrastructure, which is basically looking at creating a clear pathway for trade corridors, more so with the network in terms of rail line, in terms of road system, and even aviation. So that creates an opportunity for us to symbiotically play into the trade system for us to meet up the obligation even when it comes to debt repayment, meaning we can be able to turn the economic turbine and make up for taxes through private sector participation and even government as well. From that combination, the government obligation in terms of payment can then be made forward from there. But in the Zambian case, we have made a specific case where we have a chamber that is basically working out to receive Chinese currency in our national treasury, meaning we can use that same Chinese currency and pay off the debts so that we avoid the exchange losses that we have actually been able to see over time. Because the situation where the players in the market were selling their end product in Chinese currencies, we have on the band of investors, there became a very difficult situation for us to start making conversion twice. So meaning we are not going to actually get the conversion of the exchange market. Even when you look at the local market performance as cities right now, we are talking of having combination of different currencies interplaying, meaning we will not be able to use dollars, one currency or single commodity carrier. We have a split of use of taxi payment from there. So meaning we can also use actually the local currency, which is actually standing at 25% of tax receipt And then we have sustained dollar at 60%, meaning 15% is also playing out with the Chinese currency. That facilitates now the exchange flexibility, which we have actually been able to underscore and see the effect, coming up with a lot of good elements, which is now speaking into inflation, speaking into interest rate and all those factors. So now coming back to your question, maybe as I conclude, I think it will be important that if the more we interplay with China regarding even the debt portfolio that we are carrying as Africa, it will be much easier to make the repayment obligation because we'll be dealing with them direct and we'll be able to access their currency, which actually makes everything flexible from that model.
All right. Now, Herbert, infrastructure remains the biggest bottleneck. Now, if a producer in a landlocked country like Ethiopia or even Rwanda cannot get their goods to a port efficiently due to poor roads or energy shortages, how do they realistically compete in the Chinese market, regardless of the tax status?
Thank you so much. So infrastructure is one of the structural barriers and long-standing structure challenges. And it's really beyond infrastructure. But what needs to be done in order to position really our private sector and SMEs in order to really produce and be able to meet standards, we need to look at trade infrastructure, address the trade infrastructure, but also we need to ensure that the infrastructure that we are addressing is feeding into what we want to export. For example, we need to leverage the Chinese technology. China has been a key player in the infrastructure sector in Africa. How then can we leverage really the Chinese technology so that as part of our negotiations, we are negotiating with China to ensure that we are developing infrastructure to aid trade. And so as part of our negotiations, there is need to ensure that even issues of technology transfer are negotiated so that our industrial capacity is addressed. And beyond infrastructure, there is need to also look at really other issues like export credit and other challenges that curtail competitiveness of our private sector. Because without addressing the same, we will not fully benefit from the Chinese market. Take the example of AGOA, African Growth Opportunity Act. There was limited utilization of tariff preferences because of challenges connected to infrastructure, standards, among others. So the removal of tariffs alone will not guarantee the penetration of our products into the Chinese market. But rather, we need to also ensure that those long-standing structural challenges, including infrastructure and linked to trade, are addressed. Thank you.
Okay. Now, coming back to Rugare, briefly, please, because we're about to wrap up. The implementation date is set for May 1, 2026. What reforms must African regulatory bodies undertake in the next 14 months, to ensure that they are not caught flat-footed, when the gold rush to the east begins?
I think a measured and steady approach is needed to respond to all global developments beyond this trade context. So quite often you'll hear about how African countries and other low and middle income countries are pushing for reforms to international systems. But I also think that at the same time, we also need to get our own affairs, our own houses in order. Quite often you'll see that regulations within a country aren't harmonized. So some industries or some sectors aren't moving in the same direction. They may be even getting in each other's ways. So we need more coordination, more communication with regulatory bodies and the government ministries that oversee them so that everything is coming from a harmonized position within the country so that when we then engage with neighboring countries, with regional partners, and then with international partners like China, we're moving in the same direction and speaking in the same playbook.
All right. So let's hear from Charles as well. Same question.
Well, I think it is important, we build harmonize the institutional process, find a way to, and I think a much more framework of the continental free trade area is an important framework for standardizing rules, for standardizing and harmonizing policies. I think if we truly utilize and properly utilize the mechanism of the African free trade, we can work out a much more harmonious approach, integrated approach to this. And like I said, you've spoken about May 1st being the date of takeoff. This is not just coming from nowhere. I've told you how this has evolved over time, and the mechanism of the China-African Trade Economic Expo, which has been holding since 2018. It has held over 4 editions. It's been a very important window for African products entry into Chinese market. So I think we can seize the experiences gained over this period. China has been hosting Import Expo for the past 6 years, which a number of African countries have been invited. And with the nimble trade mechanism of the Trade Facilitation Hub in Changsha, which most African countries have always participated, we will not likely be caught unawares. The opportunity of the May 1st tariff entry to China will not be, we will not be looking for belts. We have some insight as what to do. And I think if the leadership and our bureaucracies are serious, there has been ample time to prepare for this important day. So the question is if Africa is ready to seize the moment. But like I said, it didn't just happen. It evolved.
Absolutely.
We saw it coming. And it is important that we are not
Charles,
taken by surprise.
Sadly, we don't have more time, but would love to thank our guests for taking time out of their busy schedules to actually speak to us on this. We've had Rugare Mukanganga, economist in Zimbabwe. We've also had Charles Onunaiyu, Director of the Center for China Studies in Nigeria, in Abuja. Kelvin Chisanga, economist from Zambia, and also Herbert Kafeero, Deputy Executive Director, Seatini in Uganda. Thank you once again, gentlemen, for your time.